So today I want to talk about one of my grail watches. It's a massively underrated and underappreciated Rolex. Of course it's a Rolex. So welcome back to Bark and Jack. I'm Adrian and today we're talking about the Rolex Turn-O-Graph. It's kind of the black sheep of the Rolex family and they killed it off in 2011 because it was such a failure. But it didn't start that way. It's probably the one watch out of the whole Rolex history that's had the biggest impact on the way Rolex looks today. It holds so many certificates for being first in things for Rolex. For example, it was the first Rolex tool watch. It was the first Rolex to ever have a rotating bezel. And it was the first Rolex sports watch to be made out of a precious metal, gold. So Turn-O-Graph was introduced in Baselworld in 1953. Now, when you look at it, it looks like a Submariner. The Submariner was based on the Turn-O-Graph. It was based on its ability to be used as a timekeeping device, not just to tell the time of the day, but to keep time by using the rotating bezel. The rotating bezel kicked the Turn-O-Graph into the sports tool watch arena because the rotating bezel was just so useful for a time marker. You will have seen images of old Submariners without the crown guards, and that's because it was a direct copy of the Turn-O-Graph without the crown guards. When the Submariner became a dive watch and it was quite easy for someone to knock the crown and damage the crown, that's when they introduced the crown guards to it. So in the mid-70s, the Turn-O-Graph changed shape, changed family. It moved from the kind of, and this is where Rolex started to kill it off in, I don't know whether it was, we'll never know whether it was intentional or not, but they kind of handed over that tool watch to the Submariner range, and the Turn-O-Graph then joined the DateJust range. It's now called the reference 1625 and it uses the case and movement as a 1601. So it uses the caliber 1570. Because it uses the same case, it's obviously got the same dimensions as the 1601. So it's got 36mm wide case and it's got 20mm wide lug width. Absolutely perfect for me. I'm a big fan of the DateJust, especially the old daintier vintage cases. So I feel this 1625 it's kind of taken the DateJust and it's the next step. Well, it's a DateJust on steroids. It's got something beefy, something purposeful about it as opposed to being a dressy watch. It feels like there's something extra there. It works really well. I know loads of people hate it. Loads of people confuse. Is it a sports watch? Is it a dress watch? It is confused, and I quite like that kind of confused state about it. I feel similarly about the Yacht Master. It doesn't make sense to have a watch with a platinum bezel. It's unnecessary, but then that's also very cool at the same time. And I kind of feel like that's the same with this watch. Now, the one that particularly caught my eye was this photograph. I saw this at auction probably about 3 years ago, and I think about this watch so often, and it's so hard to find the blue dials. There's lots of silver dials, there's lots of gold dials, but blue dials are really hard to find, and I've not seen one since. Now, what I loved about this particular piece was the way the straps work with the dial, the way the dial works with the bezel, and then how the bezel has aged. Because it's gold, it's been worn down in certain areas, and there must be stories behind people using it, or I'm sure it's just someone sitting at a desk. But I like to think about the romance around that. And the fact that the bezel has dirt and grime in the numerals, the whole thing just adds to the character. So this particular one is my absolute grail watch. Now this watch, the 1625, is nicknamed the Thunderbird because it was a watch that was given, or they say it was developed for, but I don't quite believe that. But it was a watch that was given to the US Air Force Thunderbird pilots, the display teams. Which I think is a funny name because in the UK Thunderbirds are a different thing. So it's got a cool aviation military connection to it, but it was also, there was a kind of serious side to that as well. Obviously that was Rolex's marketing. But the fact was, this was the first pilot watch before the GMT. This came out before the GMT. And because it had a rotating bezel, it allowed pilots, it allowed people to use that bezel as a timekeeping device, which gave it its whole kind of tool watch feel to it and actual purpose as well. So the reason I'm doing this video now is I've got a whole list of videos that I keep, and this video has been sitting in that list for ages. I keep bumping it down the kind of priority list. And the reason I'm doing it now is for two reasons. One, I'm doing a collaboration. I actually recorded a collaboration with Teddy Baldassar around watches that are underrated, and I couldn't help but talk about this watch in that video, and I thought, well, actually it kind of makes sense to now talk about it as a longer video of why I love this watch. The second reason is Theo and Harris listed an incredible version of this 1625 on their website. I contacted Christian from Theo and Harris and asked him if I could use his photographs for this video, and he responded saying, yeah, sure thing. So it's a massive thanks to Christian for being cool about me completely stealing his lovely photographs. Now there's another reason for mentioning Theo and Harris. They had this watch listed for $3,000. It's sold now. And I was so close to pulling the trigger, but I was put off by import tax, which I've now learned is quite minimal, but I was worried it was going to be a couple of $100. Anyway, mentioning Theo and Harris, they had this watch listed for $3,500. Now, if you think of the history of what this watch is and the impact it's had on the Rolex kind of timeline and all the models that superseded it, $3,500 for essentially a vintage Datejust with far more history and far more prominence than a Datejust. I think that is, I'm not going to say affordable, it's incredible value. And that's what these watches generally are. It varies, the price varies massively according to what region you're in. If that watch was in the UK, I reckon it would be selling for probably around £4,000, maybe £3,500, £4,000. But in the US, maybe the market isn't that strong for these sorts of watches. And that was an absolute steal. It's sold now, so there's no point going to check it out, apart from looking at the photographs again. But that's kind of my point around this watch is that it's such an important piece, yet it's so undervalued. And I'm in the market for a new watch, and I kick myself for not buying. I mean, their version wasn't my grail. I really want the blue dial, but at that price, I should have done it. Rolex turned off the Datejust for a while, and they reissued it in the 2000s. And I don't know what the hell they were thinking when they did that. It's such a horrendous watch that they launched. If people were confused with the 1625 being whether it was a dress watch or a sports watch, what they launched was even more confusing. It was essentially a Datejust with an actual fluted bezel that rotated, and it makes no sense whatsoever. You have an obvious tool watch. It was launched as a tool watch, and they just completely screwed it. It is ugly as hell. I've never seen one of these in real life. It's quite a shame what they've done to it. They had this incredible watch, and it's proven to be incredible because the Submariner is such an icon, not just with Rolex, with the whole watch world as a branding icon. Everyone knows the Submariner, and that started from this Turn-O-Graph. So it's a shame that they've killed it, and it's as if they purposely killed it, because what they did in the 2000s was just nuts. Anyway, guys, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the Turn-O-Graph. I know it is a Marmite watch. It is a funny looking thing, and there's a part of me that always likes a bit of the underdog and likes something different, and maybe that's what draws me to the Turn-O-Graph. I think it's a great size, and the bezel gives it a little bit more beefiness to it. It is a very, very cool looking piece. But I'd love to know your thoughts on it. And what are your grail watches? I don't believe anyone has one grail watch. Quite nice to be in a position where my grail watch is obtainable. A lot of people have grail watches that are mil subs or early editions of the Speedmaster. I'm quite lucky in that respect. In fact, I'm quite tempted to look for this grail watch. Guys, I'd love to know what you think of the Turn-O-Graph. Is it something that you're interested in? Especially if there's someone who actually likes the final version of the Turn-O-Graph, because I do think that's a pretty funny looking watch. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this sort of stuff, do hit subscribe down there. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Check me on Instagram @BarkandJack, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.